I'm Max Anderson. I'm the Melvin and Bren Simon Director and CEO, and grateful to have all of you here tonight. A portrait of modesty is what the Wall Street Journal described this evening's guest as being, Richard Armstrong, in a profile that ran a few weeks ago. And he was answering a question about how he was faring as the new director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation and Museum. And he offered the following: "Unlike any animal that's new to the kennel, you get to know the other animals and sniff out the corners."
The problem is the Guggenheim doesn't have any corners.
I think you can see what kind of evening it's going to be. Well, from his Kansas City origins and moving on to being a Senate page and a museum goer in Washington, he moved on to France and then the Whitney, La Jolla, LA MoCA, back to the Whitney as head of its independent study program and a member of its curatorial staff, and then became curator of contemporary art at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh in 1992. He organized the 1995 Carnegie International, became chief curator later that year, and went on to be, in 1996, appointed the Henry J. Heinz second director of the Carnegie Museum of Art. And on his watch in Pittsburgh were an enormous number of changes for the better: the renovation of the Heinz galleries, the expansion of the Heinz architectural galleries that allowed all of the museum's curators to have more room to play in and present important and ambitious exhibitions, among them Aluminum by Design, Light, the Industrial Age, 1750 to 1900, and several Carnegie Internationals, 95, 99, 04, and 08. And in 2003, the museum acquired the Charles Teeny Harris Archive, which is a collection of more than 80,000 negatives by Teeny Harris, who photographed life in Pittsburgh in the African American community from the 1930s to the 1970s. And this was one of many, many, many acquisitions that Richard made as the director of that great institution of material primarily the 19th through the 21st centuries. And tonight we'll get into all of those facts plus some of the features of his expansive new kennel. And so please join me in welcoming Richard to the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Max, and thanks to everyone for being here. There's the doghouse, and you know it well, but we don't typically see it from this vantage point, which I found kind of interesting. You may not know that when Frank Lloyd Wright was commissioned in 1943 to do this museum, it took him 16 years to realize it. His idea was to put it up in Henry Hudson Park in Upper Manhattan and have people drive there and have it on a hill, which is his typical reaction to everything. Put it on a hill and drive to it. His wife was the cousin of Robert Moses's wife, and they called each other Cousin Frank and Cousin Moses. And it's Robert Moses who took him around the city and ultimately helped the family, which was in shock at what they'd unleashed with this architect in building the institution, because that's Mr. Guggenheim, son 5 in a big family of 7 boys, and ultimately this is a family that controlled most of the mining in the world, but especially in North and South America, and probably ranked with just a few other families in terms of available capital. Not a distinguished collector, but his wife introduced him to this painter, Baroness Hilla von Rebay, who was sort of a groupie of some of the Bauhaus painters, and she herself painted Guggenheim's portrait, and they made an alliance, certainly a spiritual one, where his not very interesting post-impressionist pictures suddenly became very important pictures by the artists like Kandinsky and other people of that ilk. And together they started this thing called the Museum of Non-Objective Painting on 53rd Street in Manhattan. So this is a slide from 1939. When this institution began. It had been a car showroom. Baroness Rebay had very definite ideas not only about what was on view, but how also it should be seen. You can recognize these pictures as unusually low. They're hanging on pleated velvet walls, and there's music being piped in. So it's a kind of a Gesamtkunstwerk, and peculiar, and always thought of in New York as an eccentric place to go visit art. Remember, the Museum of Modern Art was about 2 blocks away and had a very puritanical and very directed way of seeing contemporary art and modern art. This, on the other hand, you could say is a kind of weird German fantasy in Midtown New York. So in 1949, the family bought this building at 1071 Fifth Avenue, and then eventually the lot next door, and the museum in 1949 moved uptown to the location we know today for a few years. Mrs. Rebay was dismissed on the death of Solomon Guggenheim as the director, and she'd taken the museum about as far as she could take it in her path. And they elected James Johnson Sweeney, a very distinguished art historian, as the second director, and he quickly brought in new blood, new ideas, including sculpture, because in the first 10 years, Mrs. Rebay's position was that sculpture could never be non-objective and therefore had no position in the collection. One of Sweeney's first exhibitions was this Brancusi retrospective, from which he bought 11 Brancusis for the collection. Then you'll see by 1951, this corner lot had become available and they tore down even more property. So the drawings are evolving from 1943 all the way through the war. Mr. Guggenheim isn't interested immediately after the war in realizing the building because of inflation, so everything was put on hold. Eventually, this is what happened when that building that they owned in 1949 was taken down, and Frank Lloyd Wright really devised two interlocking shapes. One, this ziggurat, which is comparable in a way to a parking ramp, and really grew out of an automobile museum that he had proposed outside Baltimore. And then another building to the right, which we've only just now opened up again to make clean, which is called the Monitor Building, and we'll see a better view of that coming up. But you see that it's two peculiar but very energized shapes that intersect one another at an unlikely place. I describe it, when I'm trying to be serious, as alternating, depending on your mood, as either a springboard or a corset, the building. So there it is, and for those of you in the audience who like technical stuff, this is the first big application of gunite. So the entire thing is being blown on by big hoses into forms, and they're removed. Last year they spent $27 million redoing the facade and cleaning up the building, because it's not really a material that's meant for the ages, but it's the only one that allowed enough sort of fluidity of form that Wright could achieve the shapes that he was after. So there it is in 1959. It's opening when Fifth Avenue was a two-way street. And you can see this Monitor Building on the left, which hasn't until very recently been so apparent because it had been sort of built over as galleries and offices. Now it's been reopened so that the fenestration's proper. Then on the right, the great ramp. You should know that Wright imagined a tower, an 11-story tower, behind this space from a very early point in its design. So the tower that Gwathmey Siegel added in 1992, which was in that first slide, really conformed both in shape and in fenestration with Wright's drawing. So even though it's not the happiest of spaces, I frequently think I'm in a squash court when I walk around those little galleries. But it's what Wright had imagined. He saw it as apartments for artists, which was another symptom of his, eccentric approach. In the 1960s, Peggy Guggenheim died. She is the niece of Solomon R. Guggenheim's brother, Benjamin Guggenheim, who died in the Titanic disaster. And as you know, she was herself an advanced collector. She had the great motto of buy a painting every day. And she did it, and they were frequently great pictures. She came over in the course of World War II, and opened a gallery in Manhattan called Art of the Century. Became a great patron, was herself allied in various ways with a number of artists, marrying Max Ernst and being Pollock's greatest patron for the first 10 years of his career. So this collection, which is where she spent the last 20 some odd years of her life, was the beginning of an incipient empire. There she is, and there's the Palazzo, which you recognize as being on the Grand Canal. It was essentially a ruin when she took it over in 1951 and built it out to her own specifications. It was meant to be a two-story house. So in a way, the second story's never been added on, but it's quite profitable as a party space. Then 11 years ago, the museum contracted with the government of Bilbao to build this big and quite large institution in a city that's not unlike Pittsburgh. In fact, I took a delegation of Pittsburgh people there 10 or 11 years ago at the very beginning to look at how another steel city was dealing with a changing identity. So this is Frank Gehry's great masterpiece, Sheath in Titanium. And there you recognize the Jeff Koons puppy out front. In 11 years, that museum has been able to attract 12 million visitors. So it's a very heavily visited place. This is a metropolitan region of about 1.6 million people. So for them to have, on average, 1 million visitors a year, it's quite an amazing stimulus to the local economy. And I also think it's changed the psychology of the region, which was mildly insular before this. And we're now talking about an expansion of this building 35 miles away on the coast, which would allow artists to be in residence in a way that may not have been achieved anywhere else, because we'd be incorporating slow food people, ecologists, and artists in a single site, maybe a little bit like your garden here. Oh, I made a mistake, sorry. There it is. So this is the central river going through Bilbao. This is about 17 miles from the Bay of Biscay. And it was, prior to this, largely deserted steel mills and fabrication sites. Now, happily, there's been more infill. There's a great Rafael Moneo building, and now a Cesar Pelli building being put up in this neighborhood as well. I also remember when I went there, and I've now been a few times more recently, I thought the place was unconscionably big at the opening and could never be filled, and I was actually offended by it, particularly the big gallery that was larger than a football field with curving walls, which I thought was hateful. And now, filled with Richard Serra, it looks like the most natural place in the world. This is a prelude to what I'm about to show you in Abu Dhabi, so I'm not a good judge of scale. That's what I discovered. A few years later, Deutsche Bank reclaimed its historic headquarters in East Berlin and made a deal with the Guggenheim to have a 6,000 square foot space at ground level, designed by Richard Gluckman on the interior. And the bank commissions, well, the museum commissions 2 artists a year to make exhibitions, and the work is then given to the collection. So it's turned out to be, oops, I just did it again, sorry. Turned out to be very advantageous for the collection. Here's a fairly recent Jeff Koons exhibition. So the bank takes 1 or 2 works for its collection, which is the largest corporate collection now in the world, and the museum takes the balance of the work. Then 2.5 years ago, the museum signed a contract with the government of Abu Dhabi to develop a cultural district on an island next to the city of Abu Dhabi. And I've discovered that a lot of people don't really know where Abu Dhabi is. I certainly didn't. So I put this map up to show you where the Gulf region is. You see Doha, which is now famous as a cultural site because of I.M. Pei's building. And then go to the right. And as you go to the right, you would have driven through largely deserted Dubai. That's only 45 miles away. So Abu Dhabi is a city dating to about 1969. It's not an old city. And this Saadiyat Island is about 110 acres on another side of an estuary that will be developed exclusively as a cultural district for the city. So that's the Gulf on the upper right and left. And here's what it will look like. The Guggenheim at the far bottom on this newly built promontory point, designed by Frank Gehry. What looks like an upside down, sled or dish, snow dish, designed by Jean Nouvel, and that's the rooftop of the Louvre. Next to that, a performing arts center by Zaha Hadid, and to the right of that, a maritime museum by Taddeo Ando. Perhaps more importantly, on the immediate left is a giant 18-hole golf course by Gary Player. And you'll see that there's a great deal of infill that's meant to be a kind of creative quarter, ultimately housing 350,000 people in this city. So there it is from above, and you can see that the Guggenheim sort of occupies this lighthouse position, and the Louvre is slightly back in a very advanced design, very good design by Nouvelle. The President of France will be signing part 2 of the agreement on May 24th, and there'll be groundbreaking the next day. So they're actually beginning construction for the Louvre. And here's Frank Gehry's working model. It's a 480,000 square foot facility. The upper level of the central atrium is 30 stories high. So it's an unusually big place. It's about 2.6 times larger than Bilbao. It will be a center for 20th and 21st century Eastern art, Middle Eastern art, Western art, and film design, video. It has a very broad range of portfolio. They imagine 2.5 million visitors annually. And there it is from the sea in a very schematic way. That'll be finished. They're signing the design documents in July. Our groundbreaking will be in October, and I can invite you to the opening in 2013. So that's the prelude, and those are the buildings. Really, probably what's more important, and you know from your experience here, is that the building, in a sense, only offers you a kind of, what would you call it, a grammar. And you really need the vocabulary and something to express to make the whole sentence of art and collecting art into something that persuades people. So I think my charge at the Guggenheim is to make sure that these buildings are all taken care of in a good way, but that they're filled with important collections, exhibitions, and most importantly, with lots of people. We offer an unusual site for socialization. That's the great charm of working in a museum. And I think if the concept of globalization ever will have cultural application, it's very likely to be inside this enterprise that the Guggenheim has undertaken over the last 15 years, and we hope will be successfully culminated in its next stage in just 4 more years.
Quite a romp, Richard. Yeah. Thank you for getting us there and inviting us all. So mark your time in the calendar to join him in 2013. Speaking of Integer 4, it's been about 4 months since you walked into 1071 Fifth as the boss. So share with us your biggest surprise in the first few weeks showing up there.
Well, it's a very complicated building, and I'm a little bit like that dog. I am poking around all the time. And it's hard to figure the building out. Also, I find it difficult in terms of presenting art because it's a constant frontal presentation of the picture or the sculpture. And if you need to go back and get, as you do so beautifully in a building like this, get a different impression and come back to it, that's not really possible in this building. So you have to think of it as a kind of constant series of drive-bys, and you have to make it the best of that. The real problem, though, was that the finances aren't very secure. So we've been going through a number of iterations about how to become more solvent.
We'll get to that, but I want to get back to the building because you did an interview with Time Magazine a couple of weeks ago, and you described the Frank Lloyd Wright building as having a quasi-sexual feel to it. So please elaborate.
Yeah, I was not so well-spoken, but one thing that's charming about it is it's chock full of people and they're all looking at each other. So that leads to all kinds of happiness.
Yes. When you arrived as the director, though, you had, as you mentioned, a fair number of challenges. And you also have some neighbors in MoMA and the Whitney and the new museum. So give us a feeling for how you're planning on differentiating the Guggenheim from those museums.
Well, one, we want to keep reasserting that global identity if possible. And by the way, the visitorship of the Guggenheim is intensely global. It's not really, and Max knows this as a New Yorker, it's strangely not a New York institution. It has a very small membership and a relatively small visitation by people who live in the city. So we want to change that because there won't be nearly so many people coming from Europe in the next few years we can imagine. But also my goal would be, and this is something that we both know from having worked at the Whitney, there's no better imprimatur on a museum than artists saying, that's my place. So we want to try and make it feel like it's a place that receives artists not only in a welcoming, but in a challenging way. And then I'd say they've begun an Asian art initiative, contemporary Asian art. We're about to launch a Latin American initiative. We will be collecting material from the Middle East. It'll be, I hope, kind of a giant crock pot of ideas. And you know, part of the great charm of it at this age in particular is watching the profession and the creative side and the visitorship become much younger. So we want it to be a museum that's really very oriented to a wide spectrum of visitors, but the under 35 people need to feel like it's in particular a place for them.
So that also means a lot of younger New Yorkers who, as you say, they flock there when possible, but it's not a constant destination for them the way it is for Europeans.
Well,
not in America.
It's probably a little bit like you vis-a-vis downtown Indianapolis. Being on 89th Street and having the psychosexual center of youth be on the Lower East Side, they're not next to each other. So you have to figure out a way that people feel it's a natural stretch to get up there. And at that age, they're not taking taxis. Right. So we're not really that close to the subway either, which is a disadvantage. But I see that it's possible. Yeah. The other thing I want to do, not to preclude what you're saying next, is I feel like that because of where we are, it's our obligation and opportunity to look north, because people who live from 90th Street South have a lot of things to do. Sometimes people who live from 90th Street up to 190th Street have fewer cultural offerings. So I want them to feel like it's their neighborhood place.
That's great. That's a great opportunity,
yeah.
And untapped. Well, let's back up and talk a little bit about where things started. You're going to Kansas City tomorrow, your hometown,
yeah.
And celebrating your birthday as I am tomorrow.
Is that incredible?
So give us the path. What was the trajectory that got you to Lake Forest and
well, I went to Lake Forest because I couldn't get into any other schools. But, you know, I had a regular upbringing. We lived very nearby the Nelson, but we didn't go there. We went to the Museum of Natural History because, you know, we were red-blooded kickers and whatever. So, but my father was on the board of the Natural History Museum, and I felt that was a natural place to go to. And we lived nearby the Art Institute in Kansas City, which was their school, so I'd smelled turpentine a lot when I was growing up, riding skateboards and bikes through there. And, you know, there turns out there was some eccentric creative people in the family. And then I thought I was going to go into politics, so when I was in Washington, because it was so hot, I would frequently go to the National Gallery or wherever that was air conditioned. And I started looking at pictures, and I don't know, I just slipped.
And you started professionally really at La Jolla in some ways. So tell us what that was about.
Yeah, really I would say I began at the Whitney because in the independent study program, which was this, you know, great 1968 style experiment of bringing young people who thought they might want to be curators and writers into the company of young artists for a year, sharing a big loft space in Lower Manhattan. I went and did that because that was okay with my parents, you know, to do. And then I realized I like being around artists, and I like this whole thing. So it just sort of took off after that.
Well, the ISP was a pretty orthodox place when you were there, as it still is in some respects.
It was a little less involved with theory in my day. It was a little more involved with beer and other stuff.
Yeah. But you were also one of the few males.
Yeah, yeah, which was, you know, kind of a mixed blessing.
And we'll come back to the Whitney, but then tell us.
So Marcia Tucker was this very, very advanced and I think truly inspired curator. She took a liking to me. She got me some jobs in New York where I would work for people in their studios, like Nancy Graves and Al Held, and artists. And I got to see people up close that way, as well as get paid, which was a real eye-opener for me, because I'm telling you, I'm from a really square background. And to be around people who, you know, did what they wanted to do day and night was amazing. So at a certain moment, I worked for the Whitney for 1 year for the 1975 biennial. And then she said, you should get a job, a real job, and here are two opportunities. I had been to La Jolla as a kid because that's sort of Kansas City West. So I went out there, and it was fun. And I made a really concentrated effort to get to know the artists who were my age. So I was about 24, I think, or something. And I would just start going to studios. You know, Chris Burden, Alexis Smith, many people who aren't well known today, but I learned so much by just going to studios and taking advantage of being in Los Angeles.
So you cut your teeth there and then back to the Whitney where you really got to work.
Yeah. In the end, California may not be where you want to live because it's really not about indoor sports out there. So it seemed like it was a good idea to go back east, and they offered me a job. In fact, they said, would I run the independent study program? So I went back and did that. I did shows, and, it was a heady moment in New York. It was the 80s, and it was the first time people had been rich for a long time, and things seemed possible.
And you took on the Whitney Biennial, not once, not twice, but 4 times.
Yeah.
So what was that, like your first one like, and how did it change over time to be responsible for all these needy artists?
I saw it as a sacred opportunity and obligation, but if you look back on it, it's a bunch of log rolling, because the curators are like trading, I'll give you 2 blues for a red. So you never really get your vision, and it really showed me when I went to Pittsburgh that what you want is to be able to be autocratic and do it your way. So what I learned, I think, was to get out of that team mentality. But I also, I went to hundreds of studios all over the country. It was unbelievable.
So your 92 was the last moment really at the Whitney.
Yeah, and that was not a good show, and that was further proof that group of people should not have been doing the exhibition.
So you found your way basically then to the Carnegie, and you've made such an important contribution to a great institution in a city that's very committed to culture, and certainly the great institution that it's from. Tell us a bit about the landing there and how different it was to be a curator there from in New York.
Well, I got to run the whole place, so it was great. I didn't have to, it was a huge department. Spatially, they had a big endowment. They were ambitious, they were collectors. The Warhol Museum was just getting going, so I really didn't have any competition. And for me, it was like just perfect. Plus, I liked the town from the very first day, so it all felt very natural. Warhol developed, became really a great complement to the Carnegie. There was a great staff at the Frick, which is, the other big institution in town. And then we have they have a great alternative museum called the Mattress Factory. So in a not very big place, there are many really ambitious people either helping each other or beating each other up all the time. So it felt like a nice, big, rowdy, city, demanding place. But I was there to do the Carnegie International, so instead of going to studios in Wichita, suddenly I was in Tokyo. So, you stop being Huck Finn and you start being something else. Because I'd been to Europe a lot, but I didn't know anything else, really.
Well, what do you miss about Pittsburgh? What do you miss about the Carnegie?
Well, one thing, and that's the privilege that you all know from living here, is you have impact. So New York is just, it's very difficult to have impact there unless you have, I don't know, either a lot of money or a newspaper or a gun. So, but in places like this, which operate on consensus, and you can be part of it, it's energizing, and you feel good about being a citizen in a place like this. That's what I liked about Pittsburgh.
Well, I had breakfast in your house one morning a couple of years ago, and we were both in different situations, but there was something very peaceful about that time in the way that you could make a change and have an impact. But are you saying that the Guggenheim is going to allow you a platform of sorts, but it's a very different platform? So how would you describe that?
Well, it's crowded. New York is very crowded. New York is also feeling very battered right now. Not only do people wonder what its future can be as a financial center, culturally, to be completely objective, it's overbuilt. So there's going to have to be consolidation and change to find out what the future of high culture can be there, what it should be, what's affordable and sustainable. And right now, it's the whole city has a kind of like, it feels like people are hiding.
Well, Tom,
They're certainly hiding from me.
you're rattling a tin cup like the rest of
Yeah.
us, so I can appreciate that. But, well, when you stepped in after Tom Krenz left, that's a totally different mindset from Tom's, which was very expansionist and very much in a different direction.
Yeah, he really epitomized a different era, which was, he was doing what you said earlier. How do you distinguish yourself from the Whitney and the modern? And he realized there was nothing he could do in New York. It had to be elsewhere. So he became highly opportunistic in terms of going around the world and trying to find a partner. Parts of that strategy worked and parts of it were probably less impressive. And I characterize to the board my duty is to rationalize all those decisions now.
So you're the grown-up.
Yeah, although, you know,
Doesn't suit you to be the grown-up.
No. I'm not sure I'm the grown-up. What I'd like to do is get the place so it feels very buoyant, and the next group is going to have a heck of a good time taking it into the next place.
So the new museum, though, is buoyant.
Yeah.
It's definitely grabbed a lot of attention in New York
Yeah.
of collectors who care about contemporary art more than perhaps its peers. So
Yeah.
how do you deal with that? Especially because you know Lisa so well.
Yeah, I find them highly complimentary. They are internationalist. They have a disadvantage in that they have a new facility that's overly constricting, in my opinion. The building's too small to really make a big case for what they're doing. But other than that, I find them, you know, tremendously refreshing and I'd say complimentary. So I don't consider it any kind of threat.
This summer is a big summer for you in Venice with the Biennale. What are the preparations and what does that involve for you?
You know, it's very social, so I'm less interested in that, but although it's important to have good parties. We're going to be presenting a Rauschenberg Glutz show, which should be, I think, quite elegant and an eye-opener. It's a part of his career that people don't know well. It'll be the one-year anniversary of his death, so it has a kind of, I don't know, memorial feel to it. We're also hopeful of expanding Venice, so part of the charge at the meetings in June is to look around the room and say, who can help us buy this adjacent villa? So the place can become bigger. One of its limitations is that it's frozen in amber. And, you know,
You can't build that second floor.
no, you don't want to, but the world didn't stop in 1969. So a very large private collection has been given to the museum. It now needs a place to show that, and it's a museum of contemporary art. So that'll be the one expansionary thing that we undertake, I hope.
Help us understand with the Guggenheim's involvement and the American Pavilion. It goes back to a beginning point, but it's not clear to everybody what that relationship
the
is.
museum owns the American Pavilion, that's all. We're just a landlord. And by the way, we didn't build it, we bought it. I think it was in 1958 or 9 to be of some assistance, and it's for sale.
Oh, it's for sale?
Yeah, if you'd like to buy it, it's all yours.
I don't see any paddles being raised out there, but
I'm not sure I own it, but I told them the other day I'm selling it, so we'll find out. But it's, you know, it's whatever it is, but there's no reason in the world that a museum wants to own that. Yeah.
So an Indiana artist, a Hoosier artist, Bruce Nauman, will be there this summer.
Yep.
And we're lending to that display, which we're very excited about. What would you say the role you hope to have down the road with biennials? Do you want the Guggenheim to be involved in the Biennale?
Well,
It's important.
that little tiny place attracts 580,000 people a year, so it has an enormous attendance.
Not everybody has been to it. How big would you describe it?
It's, you know, you saw it's a house, and there are 2 other galleries that are attached to it, so I'm not even sure how many square feet it is. It's quite modest.
I'm thinking of the American Pavilion.
Oh, the American Pavilion, it's not as big as this room.
Yeah.
It's not even 5,000 square feet.
Yeah.
It's tiny.
Yeah.
We want Peggy Guggenheim to be happy and prosperous and complementary to what goes on, both to the Architecture Biennale, which is becoming much more important in terms of intellectual influence, as well as the Painting and Sculpture Biennale. So we're going to change our program to complement both of those operations.
Well, and the flagship building in New York, then, is a challenge, as you were saying, in terms of installing. How do you see it going forward? Is it the continued approach to spectacles engulfing the whole building or more traditional exhibitions?
I think it'll probably be a little less ambitious. We won't be doing those 5,000-year surveys any longer. I see it as a museum that begins in the 1880s and goes to the future. I think that's what the founders saw it as. And honestly, as you probably know as well, the economy is such that the days of having one big thing after the other are probably gone for a while. So we'll have a Frank Lloyd Wright show this summer and then a Kandinsky show in the autumn, and we'll change the metabolism to be a little less quick.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you're the rationalizer,
Yeah.
where is Asia in this strategy?
It's missing, and that's a huge problem, but I just don't know whether I can get on another plane.
Well, you were saying, if it's Tuesday, it must be...
Yeah, there's a whole lot of flying around, so I am going to go take a little trip in October to see some people who want to be friendly.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So the management by flying around, in your case, as opposed to walking around, may
Yeah.
continue. So you wouldn't look askance at a
No, I think
seductive idea for
really
a
if
nation?
they claim that they're going to embrace global culture, they need to recognize that 41% of the world lives in one part of it, and we have no presence
Who's
there.
the they?
The board, for example, or the decision makers, my peers and betters.
Right. Are there any issues in the Gulf since the economic downturn that are prescribing somewhat what the vision was?
Well,
originally?
Abu Dhabi seems to be strangely impervious to the whole thing. So my impression, we were together a few weeks ago in London, is they're quite excited, and Saadiyat is only one of the things that's going on, and they feel quite capable of realizing that. So I'm hopeful that it won't slow down.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about what's coming up, something called Intervals, which you've described as a new contemporary art series designed to reflect the spirit of today's most innovative practices.
Well, unlike places like this, which have multiple chambers that you can present different scale exhibitions, that museum really only allows itself to be seen in one or two ways. So that's that corset approach. And this, by the way, predates me, this whole initiative, but I am in favor of it. The curators are young, and they're looking around saying, why can't I respond to information I saw yesterday? So they've devised this thing called Intervals, and what it really is filling in places where we don't normally show art. So right now it's an exhibition in a stairwell. The next artist is taking over the landmark telephone booths. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a way of using spaces that aren't today typically thought of as art presentation spaces, but allow 30-year-old artists entree into a big institution.
How big is your curatorial staff, and what are you imagining for the future?
There are 12 full-time curators, and I'm imagining ultimately having about 17 because we'll be hiring. Bilbao needs a senior curator. Abu Dhabi needs a few curators. We might try and get somebody who looks from 1950 to 1900.
1915?
1950 backwards.
1950 backwards to
Yeah.
1900?
Yeah.
Because I usually go forward, but you're going to look backwards.
Yeah.
Okay. Speaking of looking backward, you have this extraordinary Kandinsky retrospective coming up. What's that going to consist of in scale? And
It's about 80 paintings, as I recall. It was a little bigger in Munich, and it's considerably bigger at the Pompidou right now. It's the full sweep of the career. We also will be showing a fair number of prints, which is very eye-opening because it turns out to be a very tactile world that he's operating in. And it'll be, a really classy presentation of Kandinsky, the whole ramp, and all the galleries as well.
mm-hmm. And is it traveling after New York, or is
No,
that the end?
that's it.
Yeah.
So it was Munich, Paris, New York.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a good trendy. And going forward, will there be other shows of that scale that you're going to be announcing soon on your watch that you're developing?
There are things in the pipeline, and we're being cautious about them. Cash is king.
Cash is king.
Yeah, we got to get some money together before we start making big investments on these temporary exhibitions.
So if cash is king, though, you draw the line at deaccessioning. I know some of what Tom was up to caused some ripples. Are you planning on looking at deaccessioning in new ways?
The collection needs to be shaped. Yeah, it's slightly misshapen.
Okay. How does that work? What does that mean?
One wonders, does one need to own 114 Kandinskys, for example?
Well, we're very interested in Kandinsky, so if you're advertising...
I just think there's a way of deploying assets slightly differently, yeah.
We had a conference call yesterday in AMD, the Association of Art Museum Directors, talking about deaccessioning and the protocols going forward. And it's a big, challenging world today with pressures on museums to do things that were unthinkable even 5 years ago. Where does your head take you in terms of the limits that we need to draw around deaccessioning?
I think people have to be practical, they have to be pragmatic, they have to stop being righteous. They have to stop being proud of the fact the museum died, but the collection's intact, that's where we're headed, I'm afraid, in a number of provincial places. We need a cultural policy from the government about how places from Detroit all the way down through Richmond can be tided over for the next few years because they're not going to make it, a lot of them, or they're not going to make it in a way that we recognize. You're unusual because you have a considerable capital, but a lot of places haven't, and you have a big, vibrant city that's changing for the better. A lot of these places that were previously your peers are shrinking. Pittsburgh's one of them. So there needs to be, I think, an infusion of pragmatism.
But with pragmatism, there also has to come, I think, a degree of cautiousness about setting precedent. So you're not suggesting we move into a world of deaccessioning that's no holds barred, I assume. You have some...
I think I am.
You are?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So if we were to define that differently, though, you look at museums that are struggling, but they could emerge down the road. If they start depleting their collections in ways that are irreversible, that's potentially a bigger problem, no?
Potentially.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you'll be a cowboy on this, and we'll...
Yeah.
Okay. I understand. Well, speaking of cowboys, tell us about, from your career expertise and background, there are a lot of people watching tonight and here tonight who are interested in museum work, and you have always given good advice. So give some advice to some of the people who might want to pursue that as a career.
I wouldn't go to business school.
Does that put grandiose visions in one's head? Is that what happens?
I think it's diversionary. I think what is crucial is to be, almost irrationally attached to your subject. And then if you want to go beyond that, learn how to add and subtract. Figure out how to get along with people, because ultimately you're going to be extremely dependent on other people thinking that you know how to add and subtract and you know your subject. And then it all falls into place.
Well, it fell into place for you.
I think it does, and I think one of the challenges that people in my generation and yours as well is to make sure that many doors keep opening. We don't need to over-professionalize museum operation. It's an organic thing, and it's a collective. It's not a hospital. It's something else.
Well, I hear some enthusiastic response, so let's get some questions from the audience.
I've said all the wrong things. I think that's one way of looking at it, and that you might consider that a good thing, or you might not. I will say we have 4 full-time attorneys, so there are a lot of rules that go along with this. Yeah. But I think when I worked at the Whitney the first time, the Whitney opened a branch on downtown in the Wall Street area at 55 Water Street, and it was accused of, different kinds of things. But if you believe strongly that art should be available to a big audience, and the audience, for different reasons, may not have access to the place where you are, you say to yourself, is it worth going to them? So that might have been part of the motivation. Also, I think, given the success of Bilbao, I think it's a defensible model.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point. They will, through us, be collecting art starting in September, and they've begun collecting art with the Louvre already. So they have a impressive acquisitions budget, and you've probably been to Bilbao, or maybe not, but they have a collection as well. So I would say the Abu Dhabi budget's many times that. And I should think over the next 5 or 6 years, a very credible collection will fill that place. Remember those shapes that look like cones in the plan or in the models? Those are probably going to be sites where a single artist is commissioned to do something. So there'll be 5 or 6 of these large cones that are a site for one artist. It's not clear, but I think we're proposing 1950 onwards, because in the collective of the Louvre is the Pompidou. The French model has 19 museums and a collaborative to operate that facility. So we're having a meeting with the Louvre in about 2 weeks, but they have great expertise until, the 40s at least. So we're thinking maybe let them do that and we'll take over 1950 onwards. It's closed, yeah. That's one of the things I was alluding to earlier, where the strategy sometimes bore fruit and sometimes didn't. But that one turned out to be not feasible. The sad part about that was that it was a very close connection with the Hermitage in St. Petersburg.
I saw it a few years ago.
I never saw it. Anyway, it's closed. Good point. I'm really bad at long division, so. That's their ambition. We thought it was worth allying ourselves to. And I'm sure you think about the same things I do, which is there are only so many ways that cultures can interconnect, and one of them is to make wars, and another one is to trade. And then the one that we can have the most influence over is to influence each other intellectually. So if this is a worthy pursuit, then it's a darn big one, I'll say that. I didn't really show you on the map, but ultimately, if you thought of this in marketing terms, the catchment basin for the Gulf region is India, a large part of Eastern Europe. I mean, the Russians see the Gulf region as a sunny spot. I jokingly say it's their Palm Springs. So there's a considerable audience there that at present may or may not have access to intense cultural experience, but is likely to. I'm naive about this also, but they think there are enough people to make it work. Well, let me be crass, and I'll tell you how I'm now sort of looking at it from my point of view. First of all, as Max knows, directors really don't get to do anything. We just have to obey the curators. So in my case, it's a program that was relatively well formulated when I got there. And that show, which some of you may have seen, brought together this generation of mostly European artists who've taken a kind of theoretical approach to making art in a way that's about provoking activity. So we'll have Tino Segal starting in January. Do you know that artist from Germany? Well, he hires actors to do things in the space. So there's nothing on the wall, nothing on the floor. It's just actors. And they're engaging the audience or whatever. So we'll have another version of that same sort of aesthetic going on. But to be crass, as I was saying earlier, now what I'm telling the curators is, I kind of think that's interesting, and why don't we, in this new scheme of things, when we're not going to be having giant painting and sculpture shows, think about the sorbet course, which for 5 or 6 weeks allows the museum to be experimental in a different way. So Tino Segal will be one. Now we've got another one sort of on the horizon with a young architect. So the way it'll work for us, this is the only way I can explain it to you, is there would be the big painting show and the big sculpture show, but in between there would be 5 or 6 weeks where we would do that more activity-oriented thing. Also, one of the things that we discover at the Guggenheim is people come to see the building. It can be empty, and it will be at certain moments. It's a way to foreground the building and also to conserve resources.
That seems like a good Zen note to end on, Richard. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thanks to all of you.